Good even, good evening. The academic 5 minutes are over, so it's 7:05. I'd like to welcome you all to this year's Constitution Day lecture. My name is Werner Steger. I'm the head of the Department of History, Government, and Economics here at Dutchess Community College. It is my pleasure to welcome students, faculty, and professional staff, as well as members of our local community to this, our annual event. I'd like to recognize some distinguished guests we have tonight. We have here Dr. Ellen Gambino, Vice President for Academic Affairs at DCC, as well as Dale Borkert, Chair of the Dutchess County Legislature and member of DCC's Board of Trustees. Please extend a warm welcome to them. I also would like to thank Professor Matt Murray of the HGE Department and the World Affairs Council of the Hudson Valley for co-sponsoring this event. A note regarding to the logistics tonight, please turn off or silence your cell phones now if you have not done so yet, please. Also, please stay put after the lecture as Dr. Raymond will solicit questions from the audience. Constitution Day. Constitution Day became an official holiday in 2004 when, with the help of support from Senator Robert Byrd, the Constitution Day amendment to an omnibus spending bill was passed in Congress. In May 2005, the United States Department of Education backed the law when it announced that it would apply to any school receiving public funding of any kind. When Senator Robert Byrd added the Constitution Day amendment to the omnibus bill, he did so with the then recently passed Patriot Act in mind, lamenting in his speech that if members of Congress had had a proper understanding of the Constitution, and I quote, "we would not have to question aspects of the Patriot Act that might threaten privacy and due process rights of Americans," end of quote. So the mandate to observe Constitution Day at all public institutions of higher learning in our country came out of a pressing concern that only a proper understanding of the Constitution can safeguard our liberties and rights. Previous Constitution Day lectures have addressed the classic constitutional amendments dealing either with individual liberties such as the Bill of Rights, the Reconstruction Amendments that set up the federal government as the guarantor of citizenship and political rights, which in the course of the 100 years following the Civil War were eventually extended to all Americans regardless of race, ethnicity, and gender. As well, this was last year's event, a talk on the short-lived 18th Amendment. Ordinary Americans, and I think I'm not going out on a limb here, do not usually associate our Constitution with national security policy. In this sense, Dr. Raymond's talk tonight will fill an important gap here. So it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ray Raymond. Dr. Raymond was schooled at the University of Dublin, the University of Kansas, as well as Yale University. He is currently Professor of Government and History and founder and director of the Catt Institute for Constitutional Studies at SUNY Ulster. He was also teaching comparative politics and international relations at the United States Military Academy at West Point, where he also served as the Thomas Hawkins Johnson Distinguished Visiting Professor in 2009. In addition, he serves as a fellow of the Pell Center for International Relations and Public Policy and is a regular visiting lecturer at the U.S. Air Force Academy. He has received numerous other honors, including the U.S. Army's Distinguished Service Medal Civilian, an honorary doctorate from Coe College, Iowa, and fellowships from the Royal Society of Arts in London and the Gilder Lehrman Institute for American History in New York. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Ray Raymond.
Thank you, Werner, very much indeed for that very, very kind introduction. He omitted to mention the most ominous part of it, namely that I'm a former member of Her Majesty's Diplomatic Service, which means that I used to be 003. Licensed to bore. Licensed to bore, but don't worry, not this evening, I assure you. Seriously, thank you, Werner, for the very, very gracious introduction, but I have to respond to it in the immortal words of Mark Twain, when someone was kind enough to introduce him in similarly generous terms. And they were, "You deserve to go to heaven for your generosity," wait for it, "and to the other place for your exaggeration." A much more objective view of my nefarious past can be found on the FBI's most wanted list. Since the Navy SEALs took down bin Laden, and since the FBI got Whitey Bulger, I've sort of moved up the list. Easier to find, easier to find. Now, to be serious for a moment, it really is an honor and a privilege and a pleasure to give the Constitution Day at such a fine and really excellent college as SUNY Dutchess. As a two-year college, it is, if I may say so, a jewel in the SUNY system. It's equaled by few and surpassed by none. And really, it's also a very personal pleasure for me to be here because I have fond memories both of this auditorium and of the room across the way, because my oldest son, William, who's with me this evening, and his younger brother, both played concerts here, both played viola here when they were much younger, as students of your excellent music faculty. So I have very fond memories of this college in this county, which is actually my adopted home. I live just about 20 minutes down the road. Now, tonight's kind of a little bit of fun, actually, and we're going to have some fun, because it's a speech in two voices given for two different audiences. So I wonder who's going to talk to each other. Anyway, I'm honored to speak before the faculty and students of Dutchess. I'm honored to speak that there's a member of the legislature here and a vice president of the college here. But I'm also honored to speak before members of the World Affairs Council of the Mid-Hudson Valley. I've spoken for and worked with so many World Affairs Councils throughout the United States. Colorado, Charleston, Pittsburgh are a few that just spring to mind. And I greatly admire and I greatly respect the work that you all do. In this dangerous and difficult world, your work, candidly, has never, ever been more important. Okay, let's begin with some general context. We live in an unusually dangerous world, a dangerous world in which military force may, in certain circumstances, be less usable, in which, for us, the United States, and I speak as an honorary American, our vulnerabilities are higher, the geopolitical actors are more numerous and more diverse, and our interests are harder to reconcile with others. The credibility of our values has been called in question, especially since the election of Donald Trump as president. I have to say that objectively, I know this is not a partisan occasion, but you ought to understand how the rest of the world views the President of the United States. They are seriously calling in question our values and our system. This, overall, for America, has made the exercise of American power much more difficult. Now, the National Intelligence Council has repeatedly suggested in its global trends assessments that we are all evolving into a global, multipolar world in which the United States will be less dominant and will be more constrained, although it will still be the world's single most powerful actor. In short, there's going to be less room for the United States to call the shots without the support of strong partnerships. And those strong partnerships will increasingly require us to be strong adherents of our fundamental values and a strong adherence to the principles of our Constitution. Because the days when we could coerce people to support us are slipping away. The days when we'll have to persuade and persuade hard are here. Our capacity to attract allied and other friendly powers are going to depend increasingly on the degree to which we can stand not just on our military power, which still remains very significant, on our economic power, which still remains very significant, but most importantly, it will rest on our moral authority, our adherence to our core values, and above all, to the Constitution. Ladies and gentlemen, we live in very difficult times. We live in an era in which the voices of populist extremism of the left and of the right demand attention as never before. In a time of unprecedented danger in the world, as I believe it to be, the center must hold, lest the liberal world order that we created, the United States and Britain, along with some other close allies, created after 1945, lest it fall apart. And to that end, this evening, what I want to offer you is, first, a very, very brief summary of the national security challenges that we face as a nation. And second, a description of 5 distinct core principles that my co-author and I, because this is really a distillation of part of a much larger study that we published last year in the national interest. But it's a description of 5 distinct core principles that we believe should guide not this administration, not a chance of that, but rather the next one, as we're trying to plant the seeds of serious and critical debate. So let's begin. What are the challenges that are facing us? Well, 16 years after the 9/11 attacks, the United States finds itself still embroiled in Afghanistan and in Iraq. But not for the reasons that it initially went to war there. Al-Qaeda and its ilk and its various affiliates have regrouped, reorganized, and they have not gone away. They have, in fact, metastasized across the Middle East and North Africa, and the so-called Islamic State, more publicly visible in recent years, has, of course, sought to redraw by force the boundaries of the Levant, while demonstrating its ability to target cities in the Middle East, Europe, and the United States. Clearly, I'm afraid it must be said, America's strategy to pacify these regions and establish at least the foundations of sustainable, plural political systems has failed. Instead, what do we face? Instead, in the Middle East, I think we are confronted with hostile forces based in failed or failing states, fueled by apocalyptic visions, filling political vacuums previously filled by more traditional despots. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, more familiar geopolitical threats claim our attention. Russia. Oh, God, it's great. You know, I'm a Cold War veteran, and I predicted that this would come, and it has. Russia, buoyed by a decade of lucrative oil revenues, has broken one of the fundamental norms of international relations, one of the most important things that we thought we had established in Europe, namely that no aggressive nationalistic power would ever trample on the boundaries of another European country again. Well, there were many people who thought that Russia could be engaged to be a nice, stable, friendly player. You know, that is, the character who plays Vladimir Putin on Saturday Night Live says, you know, "Good evening, America. It's Vladimir. I got your back." Well, Vladimir never had our back. Let me tell you, I first became aware and first encountered Vladimir Putin. I shouldn't be telling this story, but I will. When he was KGB station chief in Dresden. He was a cold-blooded killer then, and he's a cold-blooded killer now. Let's be realistic about this. But for us, what really matters is that he broke a fundamental norm. Aggressive nationalistic policy broke down, invaded another European country, destroyed boundaries. Awful. His actions have clearly dashed the hopes of those naive enough to believe that Russia would collaborate with the West in assuring peace and security in a post-Cold War Europe. So much for that. Similarly, China, following a quarter century of spectacular economic growth that is only now showing its limits, has begun to assert a more aggressive nationalistic posture, with motives that need to be understood on many levels. Its actions have called into question another set of somewhat naive assumptions that were floating around, particularly in the 1990s. First, the notion that the prosperity of China's new middle class would move that society in a direction more akin to Western liberalism. Well, that hasn't exactly happened, has it? And second, the expectation, again, very popular back in the 1990s, that greater interdependence and a larger stake in a globalized world order would entice China into being a more responsible member of the international system. Well, in some degrees, it has, but in many other respects, it has not. Terrorism, of course, just most recently again in London, my old hometown, and great power conflicts dominate our headlines. But they're no means the only issues that dominate our agenda. The prospect, obviously, of nuclear weapons proliferation is a potential existential threat, not just from North Korea, which has them, unfortunately, and Iran, which may choose to eventually acquire them, depending on the state of play of the current multilateral agreement between the US and other key allies and Iran. But also from other powers, Saudi Arabia, Japan, South Korea, if they ultimately determine that they too need nuclear weapons for their own security against regional rivals. And God help us all if they do. We've got more than enough nuclear powers in the world. And then we have to face yet another potential existential threat, global climate change. The impact of global climate change has already exacerbated the potential for conflict in Africa and the Middle East, and threatens to undermine some of the most fragile developing countries in the world. If you had a chance to see Al Gore's most recent film in Upstate Films, as my wife and family and I did, he's got some very interesting analysis of the geopolitics of all of this, and it is really worrying. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, our allies are experiencing critical debates about their own identity and their own role in the world. In Japan, these days, one hears persistent and highly placed rhetoric about becoming again a quote-unquote normal country. In South Korea, there is understandable frustration with a frozen and increasingly dangerous peninsula. In Taiwan, there is renewed interest in claiming their own national identity. And this, of course, complicates relations with Beijing and creates a whole ripple effect of danger throughout the whole security structure of Asia. And in Europe, never to be forgotten, and in Europe, economic stagnation and floods of immigrants and refugees have reawakened the darker, and it must be said, uglier sides of nationalism, nativism, and xenophobia. Indeed, Werner, can I just take a moment to single out the courageous leadership of Chancellor Merkel of Germany, who has demonstrated a voice of sanity, decency, and humanity. And fingers crossed, it looks like she will survive and win another term as Chancellor of Germany. Meanwhile, I'm sorry to admit that my own country has gone stark, bloody mad. I'm referring to Brexit. Brexit, I'm afraid, is symptomatic of a broader force that may yet unravel the foundations that have given us confidence about peace in Europe for almost 3/4 of a century. Now, one last big challenge, and it creates domestic pressures on us in terms of shaping our foreign policies, and that is, of course, globalization. The past quarter century has witnessed an extraordinary explosion in prosperity, health, and technological advances to improve human life. Moreover, globalization has expanded significantly the distribution of so many of these benefits beyond the handful of industrialized societies that dominated the global economy throughout much of the 20th century. And yet, this period has also witnessed an alarming growth in the disparity in how those benefits have been distributed, both at home and abroad. contributing to growing levels of disaffection, anger, alienation, that in the extreme continue to foster and even continue violence between individuals, groups, and states. And indeed, those internal threats bubble up and present challenges for the making of foreign policy and threaten the liberal world order. What I think also, and I must make this point, really frightened me, as someone who was in my diplomatic career primarily an Americanist. I was the Prime Minister's, for a number of years, I was the Prime Minister's eyes and ears on American politics. But it profoundly disturbs me, as someone who loves America very, very deeply, as someone who believes in it, and who is a committed internationalist. I really was profoundly disturbed, as was my co-author, by the kind of ideas, if one can dignify them as such, that came up in the 2016 presidential campaign. There was questioning not just the nature of American global leadership, but whether the United States should lead at all. Questioning not just the structure of our global trading relationships, but whether the United States should promote international trade at all. Questioning not just the extent to which the United States should intervene in defense of what we believe to be universal human rights, but whether it is even America's place to do so. Questioning not just the way we should best balance diplomacy and military force in pursuit of our objectives, but whether either instrument is effective or relevant in this new world. Questions not just about how we balance the strictures of domestic and international law in pursuit of our goals, but, and this really horrified me, whether adherence to the rule of law and adherence to the Constitution is really any longer necessary or appropriate in this era of popular passion and popular fear. As a committed internationalist, as someone who loves this country very, very much, I was horrified, as I'm sure many of you were as well. So, to this end, my co-author and I wrote 5 principles. First, American leadership is essential. Second, leadership, that US leadership, must be collaborative, not unilateral. Third, we don't have the luxury of ignorance. Fourth, empathy is the most important strategic virtue, hubris the most dangerous strategic vice. Fifth, and perhaps most important of all, our adherence to the Constitution is of absolutely vital preeminence. Okay, let's take the first one. American leadership is essential. American power will remain preeminent for the immediate foreseeable future. I'm worried about it beyond the next 5 or 10 years, but we might make it to there, we might not. But for the moment, we are still preeminent. And we are still the single largest economy in the world. Our military is without peer on the planet, although it is rapidly declining because of chronic underfunding. And the United States remains the only country in the world that can project military power and sustain it to another part of the world over a period of time. As a society, at least until President Trump came along, we remained, and we were, a magnet for people from all over the world as a way and in a way that no other country was. Now, by the way, foreign students are increasingly seeking to go to Canada rather than coming to the United States. America remains an exceptional nation. It is, even as we acknowledge, as we must, that America is a fallible nation with its own serious domestic challenges. But great power, as we still have, brings great responsibilities. The United States assumed the mantle of global leadership following the 2 world wars in the first half of the 20th century. And those 2 wars had left in their wake both a far-reaching political vacuum and hostile forces willing to fill that vacuum if we did not. With Allied, especially British help, the United States, Britain, and a couple of other close allies built a new rules peace-based order that defined a resilient international structure, and that structure prevented any other war between the great powers. And we've enjoyed that level of peace over the past 70-odd years. Let us not throw that out. It is very important. We also built the foundations of a new global economy, and it has brought more prosperity to more people over time than at any other period in history. Let's not throw that one out either. It also it created structures, a political infrastructure, into which new states could come. We weren't trying to be an exclusive club that said, okay, we're calling the shots and you're not in. On the contrary, we tried to be inclusive. These institutions, from the United Nations to NATO, the World Trade Organization, all of these institutions, the International Monetary Fund, they remain absolutely vital, and we lose them. We weaken them, we belittle them, we endanger them at our peril. Now, to anybody who is tempted by the siren song of isolationism, either on the left or on the right, I would say this. American global leadership is not an act of philanthropy. It isn't. It is an act of self-interest. America's interests are global. And even while in the 19th century, America avoided entangling alliances, at the same time, speaking as an honorary American here, we understood that our prosperity depended on being part of an international trading system. And we, more than once in that century, used military force to protect freedom of the seas. After liberating Europe twice in the 20th century, lest our own security be threatened, our unprecedented peacetime commitment to Europe through NATO was an essential preventive measure that has secured a longer period of peace in history, of peace in Europe, than Europe has enjoyed for most of its history. Similarly, American engagement in the Pacific has been an essential foundation for what even the Chinese leadership has called, and I quote, a constructive force for peace and stability in the region. These institutions, these alliances, remain absolutely vital today. In recent years, we've become more intertwined with an increasingly globalized economy. We enjoy an unparalleled ability to project influence and to grow our economy. But we've also become increasingly vulnerable to the loss of critical resources, to economic shocks across the globe, to epidemics, cyber attacks, as you'll recall from last year, cyber attack on our whole election system by the Russians. And yet, the international system depends on preserving a kind of dynamic stability, the ability to adapt to change peacefully, without violence, without war, without fear, and without chaos, which could cause the whole system to unravel. That is why American leadership continues to be vital. Okay, principle number 2. Leadership must be collaborative, not unilateral. The nature of international political power is changing. Successive National Intelligence Council global trends assessments have highlighted what they call, and I quote, the diffusion of power. Within the international political system, power is really a capacity to influence, which depends not only on the instruments of power that we possess, but also on whether those instruments will have any effect on the other. In that respect, perhaps the old classic concept in international relations about balance of power perhaps is less helpful than it used to be. And perhaps we ought to be thinking more about a balance of vulnerabilities between states. It follows, however, that power is a relational concept. We have power in relation to other states, circumscribed by our ability to affect what other states value and to persuade others to join us based on our own values. In a globalized world, we have enormous influence, but our ability to coerce is much less than it was. Our global success comes and will increasingly come from our ability to persuade, to identify shared interests, even in relations with our adversaries. And ultimately, in our relations with our allies, our leadership is more effective when we enjoy the respect of those we are leading, and when those we are leading believe that they have a stake in the system. And these ideas, I think, point to a simple fact, that we needn't start crying in our teacups over rising powers within the international system. It does not necessarily mean war. It does not. For the foreseeable future, American power remains preeminent. But it must, and indeed certainly under President Obama, it was trying to make room for the emergence of new powers with different voices and different perspectives within the international system. Because the old world, the sort of world of roughly, say, 1945 to the 1980s perhaps, or even into the 90s, that international order was the product of a small group of largely like-minded democratic powers, led by the United States and Britain and others. And it commanded the preponderance of global political, economic, and military might. The United States operated as chairman of the board, chairman of a small and very homogeneous democratic board. We all shared the same values, right? United States with Britain, France, West Germany, and then Germany, right? Democratic nations. We all shared the same norms, the same commitment to the rule of law. And yet, even then, and I caution on this point, even then, American leadership did not extend to remaking the world in our own image. We did not have the power 40 or 50 years ago that some people would lead you to believe we did. We didn't have it, not back then. We did not have the ability, even at the height of American power, after the years after World War II, to completely change the world. We didn't, and we don't have that power now. To bring together the same preponderance of power around the table today, we have to reach out to the G20, which of course began under President Bush, with countries from every region of the world encompassing a wide array of cultures, religions, ethnicities, form of government, and economic structures. So, that's the allies. But with our adversaries, reaching out, identifying, and finding common interests is vital. We did it during the Cold War. Even in the most frigid moments of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union shared a basic interest. Do you know what it was? Survival. Well said. Survival. Survival. And through regular and careful diplomacy, we developed a shared vocabulary for managing our very fragile strategic relationship, which ultimately bore fruit in a litany of arms control agreements and confidence-building measures, nurtured through continuous diplomatic interaction and engagement, and that helped stop any disagreement or conflict from escalating out of control. We did it. It wasn't easy, but we did it. And that logic, we, my co-author and I, believe, should extend to today's competitive relationships, especially in dealing with emerging, or rather more accurately, re-emerging powers. Because remember, there was a great cover of The Economist a year or two ago, and it said, let's party like it's 1793. Well, in 1793, China was a huge player in the global system, right? So it's not so much the emergence of China, but the re-emergence of China, and of course the re-emergence of Russia. And I think we need, and indeed Iran, perhaps as well. This does not suggest in any way that we become indifferent to their behavior when they violate the fundamental tenets of the international system. We must respond in a muscular but restrained way, whether it's in Ukraine, whether it's in the South China Sea, or elsewhere. We must not allow those conflicts, to which we must respond firmly, but we mustn't allow them to blind us to the fact that we do actually have shared interests. For example, who was one of our most important allies in negotiating the global climate change agreement in Paris? Anybody know? China. Well said. It was China. We can find common interests, and we can, in fact, work together. And indeed, working with our allies, our close allies, we must be careful, because we must understand that our allies need to feel a part of the system. And that means, little memo to the White House, no belittling of allies in public, not just this incumbent, but his predecessor. No belittling of allies in public. No. Give them a stake in the system. And then, by all means, invest and ask them to invest their fair share in preserving the system. For our part, for America's part, it's vitally important to treat allies with the respect that they deserve and keep faith with our commitments. Alliance commitments are treaties. They are treaties negotiated by the administration and signed in turn and ratified by the US Senate. They are not optional extras either. And treaties convey binding commitments. They are not transactional business deals. Third point, third principle. We don't have the luxury of ignorance. And this bit is all about intelligence. I had hoped that my more esteemed and more famous colleague, as I'm only 003, you know the other one, you know the chap who drinks the martinis, right, and so on, he couldn't be with us. I'm afraid James is away on assignment this evening. Seriously, because our own lives and our livelihoods depend in large measure on what happens around the world, we cannot afford blind spots. We must therefore invest carefully and strategically in our nation's intelligence capabilities so we can anticipate, understand, and carefully weigh all the prospective problems and issues when they arise. To avoid the blind spots, two key elements of communication need to exist within the policy process. First, obviously, the intelligence community must be able to produce really good, actionable intelligence. Second, those in key policy positions need to be intellectually prepared to listen respectfully and to assess what the intelligence community says. To accomplish this, my co-author and I believe that there are 5 things that are necessary in the relationship between policymakers and the intelligence community. First of all, it's important to understand that intelligence is inherently replete with uncertainties and ambiguities. In my 20-year-long diplomatic career, I only saw one solid piece of intelligence where you could really say, right, that's a slam dunk. Only once in 20 years. Intelligence is a little bit like looking through a keyhole, right? Hearing some, and sometimes parts of the conversation, and then trying to make sense of it all. You can see some of the people are in the room, you can hear some of the conversation, but you can't hear it all. Intelligence has great limits. It's replete with uncertainty and ambiguity, and we need to be honest in admitting that. Second, intelligence cannot and must never be politicized. It must never be politicized. Thirdly, debate within the intelligence community, particularly one as big as the US has. There are 15 different intelligence agencies. The UK gets by with just 3. But there are 15. And debate within those agencies should be encouraged, never discouraged. Fourth, technical intelligence. That's electronic eavesdropping, right? Technical intelligence is always critical. But my friends, there is no substitute. There is no substitute for good old-fashioned human intelligence. Spies. There is no substitute for good old-fashioned human intelligence. And finally, the recipients of intelligence must be willing to listen, and listen respectfully, while suspending, at least temporarily, their own preconceived notions of reality. All policymakers, of course, have filters, whether you're dealing with a Democratic administration, Republican administration. Look, the reality is all policymakers, most of whom are active politicians, have filters, of course they do, through which they receive intelligence. But for the sake of the country, for the sake of its national security, they have to be prepared to put those filters aside and consider fairly, honestly, and objectively the intelligence that has been brought to them, and by the way, never, ever to compromise its sources. Second last point, our fourth principle. Empathy is the most important strategic virtue. Hubris, the most dangerous strategic vice. In a recent lecture at the US Air Force Academy, Sir Lawrence Freedman, the very distinguished British student of grand strategy and author of the landmark book Strategy, a History, reinforced the importance of empathy as a strategic virtue. What I mean by that is simple. Security, whether of a state or of any other community, is always in the eye of the beholder. If we are to understand our own security environment, we need to be able to see that same environment through the cultural and the political lens of those with whom we are dealing. We must. Conversely, it is easy, way too easy, to project onto others our own values, our own interests, our own priorities, our own perspectives, and then to assume that these others will view the world through the same set of lenses. Even with allies, it doesn't work that way. Having spent 20 years in diplomacy, I know a thing or two about this stuff. And empathy is vital. Not because you're going to cuddle your adversary. You're not. But you've got to understand the way that they think. You have to understand, above all, the cultural and political lens of those with whom you are dealing. Hubris forms the root of strategic miscalculation, assuming that others will do what we would do, assuming that they would respond the way we would respond, and for the reasons that we would do so. This is hubris. It gets us into all sorts of trouble. It really does. Hubris can also blind statesmen. It can breed arrogance and contempt for the capabilities of potential adversaries. Hubris can also blind statesmen to the risk of war. As Sir Alistair Horn, very distinguished historian, concludes in his recent book, Hubris, the Tragedy of War in the 20th Century, and I quote, "We students of history should not succumb to our own arrogance in supposing that hubris is easy to avoid," he writes. The quote continues, "It arises out of success. In the aftermath of triumph, anything seems possible, right? Anything seems possible. And yet," he writes, "this is when so many of the most calamitous decisions are made." Is it any wonder, I'm sure some of you have been watching the beginning of Ken Burns's documentary on Vietnam. Is it any wonder, it's very interesting, I've always found, that so many of the Army, particularly the Army's leadership, US Army's leadership in Vietnam, had been basically sort of colonels in World War II. They'd seen one method of fighting, and they just applied it to another theater. But it didn't work. In the aftermath of a tremendous victory, and particularly when those who helped make that victory possible are still around, that is the opportunity when oftentimes calamitous decisions are made. The fifth, and I would submit the most important principle of all, the Constitution is not an optional extra. The rule of law really matters in foreign and security policy. Adherence to the Constitution and to the rule of law is important, not only for our domestic governance, of course, but for preserving the rules-based international system which the United States, with British help, created after 1945. For the United States, adherence to the Constitution and the rule of law is not optional. It is not optional. This great country is, above all, the child of the Enlightenment. We are the child of the Enlightenment. We are a nation of laws. We are rooted in the thinking, particularly of the English, Scottish, and to a lesser degree the French Enlightenment as well. And if the United States, at a time when its power to affect change in the world, at a time, if you will, when its chances to get its own way are less than they used to be, if the US is to exercise real influence in the world, it must exercise moral authority within the international system. We must demonstrate our own commitment to the Constitution and the rule of law. Professor Edward Corwin, an eminent legal and political scholar, doubtless quoted by my two friends and colleagues here to their students all the time, writes, of course, that the American Constitution is, and I quote, an invitation to struggle. Of course it is. It's an invitation to struggle between competing ideas, competing centers of power, and amongst competing responsibilities in the exercise of governmental authority. If there is anything exceptional about the United States, and there is, it derives from its unique historical foundations as a constitutional republic that balances, on the one hand, the need for strong government, and on the other hand, the necessity of checking that strong government through various institutional means. In foreign and security policy, the Constitution obliges both the President and the Congress to share power, even if the respective boundaries of power are blurred. What I like to call, the founders were wonderful in engaging what I like to call calculated ambiguity. They were very brilliant at that. And the powers are blurred. Treaties that bind the United States to its allies, or treaties that are made with adversaries, need to be subject to appropriate advice and consent of the Senate. But members of Congress should never arrogate to themselves the role of unilateral representatives of the state and undermine the role of the executive branch to negotiate with other states, as a group of 44 Republican senators did just a year or so ago in the Iran nuclear weapons deal. Led by Senator Tom Cotton, they had concerns and reservations about the agreement. Fine. Put them on paper and write to the President and write to the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense about it. Fine. That's making the Constitution work. But you do not arrogate and undermine the capacity of the President to negotiate by going and writing to the leaders of Iran and saying, well, you know, this is only an executive agreement and it can go bye-bye. That is unconstitutional behavior. And to be scrupulously bipartisan about this, equally wrong was President Obama's actions in defining this nuclear weapons agreement as an simple executive agreement. Now, I ask you seriously, I mean, really here, folks, let's get real here, right? If you are negotiating a nuclear weapons agreement with an adversarial state, and Iran is, if nothing else, an adversary, right? Although we can certainly try and find common interests where we can and should. Is that really an executive agreement? No, it most certainly is not. We negotiated the last nuclear weapons agreement with the Russians, and they're an adversary, and that was a full treaty. You see the picture? An executive agreement is that kind of lower level agreement that the President concludes without advice and consent of the Senate with close friends and allies, like Britain or France or Germany, right? That's what executive agreements are for. Low level, non-controversial stuff, right? You don't conclude executive agreements with an adversary, right? If that's not a full-fledged treaty, I do not know what is. And driven sadly by our polarized politics, it's what I'm afraid both sides in the Iran nuclear deal ended up doing. It's difficult enough, and I can tell you as a diplomat who negotiated treaties with the United States, it's difficult enough to engage with the United States when there is such a constitutional sharing of power. between the executive and the legislature. It is absolute bloody chaos when the political system is so polarized that the only way government can act is by the executive branch, in this case President Obama, taking unilateral action that really challenged the constitutional limits, while in this case the Senate, led 44 Republicans, refused to take action and thereby abdicated their constitutional responsibilities. Whatever you think about the agreement, it was not the way foreign and security policy is supposed to be made. In war powers, the Constitution likewise offers us no clear boundaries between the President's authority as Commander-in-Chief and the Congress's right to declare war. Now, notwithstanding the calculated ambiguity of these boundaries, the logic of our founders was that the responsibility for wielding the powers of deciding war and peace should be shared. Historically, Congress has declared war on 11 occasions. 11. And yet, on another 11 occasions, it has authorized the use of military force without a declaration of war. And yet the pendulum has swung. It has swung from attempts following Vietnam through the War Powers Resolution of 1973 to limit the President's ability to wage war unilaterally, to, more recently, the post-9/11 reality, in which the President enjoys an unconstrained authority, and I quote, to use all necessary and appropriate force to prevent any future acts of international terrorism against the United States. That is sweeping authority. In 2015, it was ironically the President Obama actually, who asked Congress to repeal this September 2001 authorization to use military force, but Congress has declined to act. In fact, the Senate just declined to act last week. Nowhere does this tension between security and liberty come into sharper focus than in questions of war and peace. Indeed, it's the classic clash between the security of the whole, the general welfare, versus the freedom of the individual. Today, war is a much more pervasive and rather ill-defined concept. Our Constitution is designed around a system of checks and balances, even if the language is deliberately vague and ambiguous. But once an institutional link, once an institutional check is lifted, which in terms of dealing with global terrorism, it really has been by the Congress, in my view anyway, it is extremely difficult to restore it. And as much as both my co-author and I are inclined to give the President latitude on the use of military force, we both fear that Congress has abdicated its responsibility in this regard by preserving an open-ended authority that has few, if any, boundaries. Let me close with one last point which really worries me. There's one aspect of war powers that really, really frightens me, and I hope it frightens you once you learn about it. Do you know that only the President has control of US nuclear weapons? There's no check and balance. Since President Truman signed the McMahon Bill into law in 1946, Congress has never revisited this important matter. The President has the sole authority to decide whether nuclear weapons should or should not be used against an enemy. With one command, one person could not only end the lives of tens of millions of people, but possibly destroy the world. I think the founders would have something to say about that, and Congress should too, because it's been lying around in the Atomic Energy Act of 1946, the so-called McMahon Bill, since 1946. This is an extraordinary presidential power that needs to be checked. Ladies and gentlemen, I've spoken for too long, and for that I hope you'll forgive me, because I do not wish to emulate the long-winded British politician of whom Winston Churchill once said, and I quote, "He has exhausted time, encroached upon eternity." So I look forward to your questions, your comments, and insults. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you so much. much, Dr. Raymond. We have time for questions. We have 2 microphones going around.
This gentleman here in the front.
So, my question is, in your opinion, what moves could the U.S. do economically or diplomatically to convince China to make either get rid of Kim Jong-un's regime or make him give up his nuclear weapons? And in regards to Russia, what moves can we do economically or diplomatically to try to keep Putin in check?
Right. On your first question, excellent question. Thank you. Really excellent question. The first point, we need to align ourselves with China. We need to make sure that there is no breath, there's not a scintilla of light between our positions. Because only that was, by the way, one of the weaknesses with the so-called 6 power talks that we've had in the past. We need to align ourselves with China so we present North Korea with a truly united front, not just the US and Britain and France and Germany and so forth, but the US and China. How do we do that? Well, first of all, we have to understand, again, empathy is the greatest strategic virtue, hubris the greatest strategic vice. Understand where they're coming from on this. They've got a complex set of interests here. And what we need to do in aligning ourselves with them is, number one, we're going to have to put some economic and trade issues to one side because we've got a more important issue to deal with. That means putting aside, for example, issues about intellectual property, issues about trade and China taking advantage of trade relations with the United States, which they have. But we need to put those aside, right? We need to put those aside for the time being. We need to understand that for China, their interest is in securing a nuclear-free peninsula, but also they want to ensure that they do not have a collapsed regime on their doorstep, because they do not want to see millions of starving North Koreans coming in a chaotic way across the border into China. It's not in their interests, right? But at the same time, we need to convince the Chinese privately that their long-standing view of seeing China as seeing North Korea as a convenient bully boy that they could use has got to come to an end. That in fact they've got a greater strategic interest in a partnership with South Korea than they do with North Korea, right? And that Kim Jong-un, or Kim Young-thug as I like to call him, who likes to throw his nuclear toys out of his playpen periodically, needs to be reined in. Now, they understand that, but we need to work collaboratively with them. That's the first thing we have to do is to basically it's not so much sanction China, but rather move in the opposite direction. Put them aside. We can deal with the other issues, the intellectual property, the trade issues, later, right? There's always time to deal with those. By the way, at the same time, we should not be engaging the most ridiculously stupid diplomacy of saying to South Korea, as the president recently did, that we're going to tear up the U.S.-South Korea Free Trade Pact. Wow, that really brings your allies on board, doesn't it? Because the other thing we need is allied unity. And that means understanding where the Japanese are coming from, understanding from the South Koreans are coming from, because remember, they live in that backyard, right? They are the ones who are most immediately threatened. Now, those are the realities of life. We need an alliance, a tight cohesion with China, and that will not be easy to get. And we need to make sure that our allies, our Asian allies, and indeed our relevant allies on the UN Security Council, namely Britain and France, are all united. And I think we pretty much are with the P5 allies, with our European allies on the UN Security Council. But that's where we need to go. And by the way, once we've done that, then I think there's some offers that we can make the North Koreans. Because let's be very honest about this. There is no real military option in North Korea. I mean, ask anybody. Look, I'm a member of the faculty at West Point. I know this. We all know this. We could mount a preemptive strike, sure. But the best we could do is probably take out about half, maybe 3/4 of their nuclear systems, because Kim Jong-un is no bloody fool. He's no bloody fool. He scattered much of the actual arsenal underground, very difficult to get at unless we were to use JDAMs and other significant Air Force munitions. But I think what we need to do is recognize something, and that is it's something that exacerbates their insecurity. And that is we never had a treaty ending the Korean War. We never did. Let's offer to negotiate a treaty with them, right? What's there to lose? We never intended to invade. We never intended to invade. We don't. We'd be crazy to even think about it. But what we can do is say to them, look, we're not going to invade you. We respect your sovereignty, and we're willing to enter into a treaty with you, and the Chinese are with us, right? And all the allies are against us. Meanwhile, we set out, we provide all of our allies in that part of Asia with the THAAD anti-missile system. We increase the number of cruisers and destroyers with anti-ballistic missile systems on board so that we reassure our allies and the North Koreans see that we are negotiating from a position of strength. Oh, one last thing. If you want to get the North Koreans, as Mark Felt, the assistant director of the FBI, a legend in the FBI, once said, follow the money. There's a lot of dirty banks in Macau that I recall from my previous career that we could go after. There's some Chinese banks. We need the Chinese government's cooperation to go after them, who are money laundering, right? That would get their attention pretty quickly, actually. As to Russia, we need to maintain sanctions. My fingers are crossed that Chancellor Merkel will be re-elected. She is our key partner in Europe. She's been very, very helpful in negotiating the Minsk agreements and ensuring that our European partners keep those sanctions on Russia. If anything, we're going to have to intensify them. And I very much agree with that approach. But in addition, if I can just mention, we need to remedy one thing, and that is to remedy the extraordinarily small force the United States has got left in Europe. I mean, again, most people forget that at the end of the Cold War, the United States began withdrawing troops back. The US used to have at one time hundreds of thousands of troops in Western Europe, and it worked. There were 2 full armored divisions in Europe. Now we only have 1 armored brigade on a rotational basis. In other words, we do not have enough military capability, nor do our allies, on the ground to deter Putin from any adventurous steps. And this goes to European allies' failure to pay, candidly, their fair share of the defense burden. And I say that even about Britain, because Britain barely gets there, and it shouldn't. But a combination of robust, muscular deterrence.
I just had a quick question. As far as our administration now, what presidency do you think our administration could kind of like look over to see how they could be better, or that didn't exist, and what are we looking forward to in the future via a male or female president? Like maybe the sex is just wrong. I don't know. Like, what do you think?
Right. Well, if there is, I must declare my view here. If there's one presidency that I believe in recent times, because one can't go further back than about 30 to 40 years because the context is so very, very different, I would urge them all to go back to the presidency of President George H.W. Bush. Dad, 41. Dad, 41, knew a thing or two, right? And he had the finest national security advisor we've ever had in Brent Scowcroft, and one of the best secretaries of state we've ever had in Jim Baker, right? Look at the coalition, the alliance that they put together to push Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, right? And I remember Jim Baker saying about a year ago, he said, we deliberately did not go into Iraq, right? And everybody was saying, why don't you, why don't you? Well, he said, now, today, nobody's saying, why didn't the first Bush administration go into Iraq? We knew what we were doing, and we didn't go in. Look at what they did in Middle East peace. Look at what they did, above all, in managing the end of the Cold War. It was brilliant. In President Bush's handling of all that, I was a diplomat working in the British Embassy, worked closely with them. It was brilliant. The end of the Cold War, looks to many of you, particularly young people in this audience, as, oh, well, it all ended with just a nice little whimper, right? Right? Well, it could have ended very, very differently. The relationship, first that Ronald Reagan forged with Gorbachev, but I think even more than George H.W. Bush forged with Gorbachev, was remarkable. And George W. Bush's, HW's dad's relationship with European allies was outstanding. He knew exactly what to do. Well, I mean, look at his background. He'd been ambassador to China. He had been director of the CIA, and he'd been vice president for eight years. That's called knowledge, that's called experience, and it's called knowing what the hell you're doing when the world is changing all around you. And I think the first Bush administration did a remarkable job in foreign and security policy, not to mention the CFE treaty, the Conventional Forces in Europe treaty, it goes on and on. The list of accomplishments in foreign policy was remarkable. And because there was a president who was a man, who was a gentleman of the old school, a gentleman who understood the world, who listened to the intelligence community very, very carefully, and who acted with great prudence and great restraint. This current president could learn a hell of a lot from him, not that he's going to try, but he should. Yeah, a woman president. Why not? Why not? The United States is way behind Europe, for heaven's sake. Britain's on its second woman prime minister, right? There's been a prime minister of Finland. The most powerful woman, the most powerful political leader in Europe is a woman, Angela Merkel of Germany. And she's a tremendous statesman. So what's up, America? Come on, get on with it. You know, it's about time. It's about time. Why not? It's about time. Women have proven themselves to be, in Europe, to be remarkable leaders. Why not? Absolutely. I'm all for it. Mom, we traveled up. Yes, this lady here. We traveled up in the elevator, I think, together. Sorry. Yeah. Yes, please. I think that was you, right?
Yes.
Yes, please.
Thank you. With regard to the president's sole authority over our nuclear weapons, how do you place that check, considering that the need for the U.S. to use nuclear weapons could be immediate? So where do you realistically place that check? And is it realistic to consider placing that check with a constitutional amendment, considering that legislation itself is so difficult to pass in a partisan Congress right now?
Absolutely. But I would draw your attention, excellent points, all terrific points, thank you, really great. I would draw your attention to the bipartisan resolution which passed on an overwhelming bipartisan majority to constrain President Trump's hands over sanctions on Russia. When the even tougher sanctions were passed by the Congress, they put in a special provision which in a normal presidency, if it had been President Hillary Clinton or President Jeb Bush or somebody like that, they wouldn't have done it. Because what they specifically did was to take away a degree of presidential authority. Because normally we have delegated to the president the authority to take unilateral action on sanctions within boundaries laid by Congress, but they took that away from him, right? And with good reason. And that with very good reason. Very good reason. And I think when Robert Mueller's investigation come out, we'll truly understand with what very good reason. But the point here is that we have to, Congress could do this. I mean, this is, that resolution on Russia's sanctions was fundamentally a vote of no confidence in the president's handling of policy with Russia. Now, I can tell you, as I have very good sources on both sides of the aisle and both houses, in both houses of Congress, they have no confidence in the president as commander-in-chief whatsoever. None. And therefore, and it could be put through as an amendment to the McMahon Act, right? To mandate at a minimum, consultation of the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and the required concurrence of a Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense. Just to give you a little check and balance, if you ever go on a Trident nuclear submarine, right? Those are really the ultimate instruments of Armageddon, right? The release of nuclear weapons cannot be authorized by the captain alone, right? It has to take orders coming from the Secretary of Defense, right? and the captain and the first officer both have to concur and both have to turn their keys before the weapon is fired, right? So there's checking and balancing down the system. There just isn't at the top. And honestly, I think given the degree to which members of Congress are of a mind to control this president's handling of foreign policy, and I'm very much in agreement with them on that, that an amendment to the McMahon Act would not be a bad thing, and I think might command a surprising level of bipartisan support.
One more question.
We're racing here. We're racing. Okay, all right. Go ahead. So
in regards to our intelligence communities, how would, especially with our domestic intelligence programs like the NSA,
yep.
How would our due process rights and the Constitution relate to that?
Well, they are. First of all, there are checks and balances built into it. I have worked with the U.S. intelligence community, and I have the greatest respect for their courage and for their integrity. As regards the NSA, let me first of all say that I find it very strange that young people, young Americans particularly, who put all of their information on Facebook and all these other things, who, you know, I'm having from everything from having a donor to who my latest girlfriend is on Facebook, are concerned about the National Security Agency. I find it very, very strange indeed, because you put it all out there, so what are you worried about? But seriously, there is a careful system of checking and balancing put in. The NSA, yes, gathers information. It gathers numbers and it gathers emails, but it cannot listen to anybody's email, and it cannot listen to anybody or read anybody's email without a specific court authority from the FISA court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act court. It's a group of a couple of dozen senior federal judges who have vast experience in national security matters. They have to go, the NSA has to go and put their case to the FISA court judges, right? And they must get their agreement, otherwise they are in violation of the law, right? And they're in violation of the constitutional system of checks and balances. That system has worked very well. Yes, to be sure, critics will tell you that, you know, on almost all occasions the FISA court has said yes. But that doesn't mean that they're a rubber stamp. They are not. Critics, I think, often don't understand the process by which it actually works, because the FISA court is not simply sitting there waiting for somebody from the NSA to come along and say, hello, hi, hello, you know, let's get Matt Murray, right? Yeah, let's do it. No problem. No. I mean, there's a very careful process that goes on, right? There's a very careful process that goes on in which they have to demonstrate something quite close to the FBI's probable cause, right? To say, why is this person a legitimate target for this form of surveillance, right? They have to make a clear case. And very often, the FISA court judge will say, no, that's just not good enough. You have to give us a better case. So there's a lot of to and fro, back and forth goes on between them. There is a process. They don't simply walk in one morning and say, hi, morning, how's the family? You know, sign here, please. That's not how it works. That's not how it works at all. What is a very careful process, you go and you have to make a serious case to the federal judges in the FISA court. And then you have to abide scrupulously by the stipulations that the FISA court lays out. I, for one, have no major concerns about the NSA's handling of this. I have a very close friend who was the chief of staff to the director of the NSA, and indeed that person, who must remain anonymous, said to me repeatedly, you know, that it is the NSA that polices itself very, very rigorously and knows if it wants to go to the FISA court, it has to have a really good case, because otherwise they will be turned down. So it's quite a complex process. But I, for one, have no real concerns at the moment about the NSA's handling of all of this. Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Raymond.
Thank you. Thank you very much.